the sooner that you can truly delegate, that you can get people to take real ownership, the easier it is to remove yourself from the business. But most of the time, we don't start trying to remove ourselves from the business until it's become so overwhelming and obvious.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, we're leaving a big space, which means it's going to take a long time for people to actually get comfortable that you're no longer in that space.
Are you feeling overwhelmed, stuck, or uncertain about how to grow your business without sacrificing what really matters most? Welcome to The Business You Really Want, the show for women ready to build a sustainable, fully aligned business. Aligned with what, you ask? You, your values, your life. Seriously, it is possible. I'm Tanya Kubo, and along with business advisor extraordinaire Gwen Bortner, we're here to show you how. If you're carrying your business on your back, chances are you do not have a workload problem. You, unfortunately, have developed an ineffective pattern of leadership. Today, we are going to look deeper at the dynamic where you as the business owner is working harder than everybody else and still not seeing any movement forward. Because despite your hard work ethic, it is not about effort. Success in business and being a true CEO, a true leader in your business is about structure. But too often, CEOs, as their business grows, end up being the default workhorse. Now, Gwen, tell me why that is. Why is it that no matter how big the business gets sometimes, the CEO is still the chief cook, bottle washer, and whatever that saying is?
I'm going to say it's because of all the obvious reasons. The business built up around them. And so pulling themselves out of that nucleus is really, really hard. I've got a client I'm working with right now that's in the middle of that process. And although mentally she's pulled herself out and doesn't want to be that person, the other folks on the team don't know how to fill in that hole. And it's not that they aren't capable. It's not that she hasn't told them. It's none of those things. It's just the reality of when you start extracting yourself or trying to extract yourself out of the business, there's a fairly giant vacuum in there. And filling in that vacuum is not like filling a vacuum where it just goes and there it is. It's actually the opposite of that. It's actually more like a growing, like healing a big wound or something.
Mm-hmm.
It takes time and it has to grow very, very slowly and has to come in. And unfortunately, because it's a slow process, we tend to reinsert ourselves back into it. And to some degree we have to, but working so that it can continue to fill in really is a hard process. And I don't think people talk about it very often. I mean, it's one of those, all you have to do is all you have to do is delegate. Like that's magically going to make it happen. But delegating to actually fill in that hole takes a long time. And we don't give it time. We expect that it's just going to be instant. And so when it's not instant, then we regress, which means we have to start the whole process over again.
Well, and in your example, sort of what I've taken from what you just said is that vacuum that's left behind. Part of the issue is that you've created a team that's dependent on you. So then you pull yourself out, they kind of feel abandoned sometimes, I think.
Oh yeah, for sure. For sure. And there's almost, I don't want to say there's no way, because I don't ever believe that, anything is not possible. But there's almost no way that there's not going to be some of that that's going to happen. But the problem is we usually wait till this is a horrible example. It's kind of grody, but I'm just going to use it anyway. It's like if you have a cyst and when you have to remove, see, I told you it was grody. If you remove it when it's tiny, it takes no time for it to heal. But if the cyst gets big, it takes a really, really, really long time to heal. Sometimes needs stitches, like it can be a big thing. And that's kind of the situation is the business has grown up around you because that's what's naturally going to happen. And the sooner that you can truly delegate, that you can get people to take real ownership, the easier it is to remove yourself from the business. But most of the time, we don't start trying to remove ourselves from the business until it's become so overwhelming and obvious.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, we're leaving a big space, which means it's going to take a long time for people to actually get comfortable that you're no longer in that space.
Yeah. And I refuse to repeat what you just said. So just
No,
listener,
that's
you're
fine.
just going to have to like
Like I
backtrack.
said, I know it's grody, but I mean, almost everybody can like see it, and it's unfortunately it's a better analogy than a lot because it's really kind of close to what the situation is because it's
Okay.
grown up around you.
So CEOs end up becoming a default workhorse because the business has grown up around them, right? So we've got this historical record of
Yeah.
the boss does all the things or run that by the boss or whatever, which then, of course, develops team dependency. I think, you didn't mention it, but in my experience, there's also a little bit of like hero worship that happens in owner operator organizations, especially if they're led by their founder.
Yeah, and it's back to it's grown up around them because they've always been the one that had all the answers,
Right.
right? And so it's kind of assumed that they're always going to have all the answers. But there's a point where the business grows to where we hear about it all the time, and it's really true. You want to hire people that are better than you, that are smarter than you, that are all of those things. And good bosses will be doing that, but those people still have seen you having all the answers. And so they forget that it's like, no, actually, I don't want to have this answer. You need to have the answer.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is just because the leader has all the answers doesn't mean that your answers, that you don't have them too, and that yours aren't equally good. And we've seen this also happen, right, where there's just a fear of delegation, whether it's a fear of delegating the wrong thing or a fear of that natural growing pain that happens with delegation. So, with that, what would you say are the structural issues in the business that are keeping the leader stuck as that default workhorse?
Well, so one is going for, okay. So here's where the real issue is because it's always a growing business. Things are always under high pressure. And so the easy answer, the fast answer is either I'll do it myself or I'll tell you what the answer is.
Hmm.
And we think that that's benefiting the business because we're able to go on to the next thing.
Right.
Or they're able to go on to the next thing, whatever it is. But the reality is almost no one really learns from someone telling them.
So how do they learn?
They learn by doing, by finding it out themselves, by figuring it out themselves, by screwing it up themselves.
I resemble that remark, Gwen. I resemble that remark.
We all do. I mean, that's really that's really the reality of it. Most of the things that we actually we learn and retain and use consistently over time, we actually learned the hard way. Now, we may have been told where to find a piece of information. There may be pieces of information we need to have, but at some point, part of it is just the doing of it. And I've seen this a lot in the organizations that this podcast tends to attract. But I've seen it in big corporate organizations as well. I've seen it with my husband and his work as he got promoted. So that, he was not, this is not a founder-led organization, anything even close. This is government, so not even close, right? But when he got promoted, he wanted to help his new subordinates, who at least one had taken his previous job, right? By being there and helping them go through the process of the various things, which I was completely okay with during the first 6 months or a year. But by the end of the first year, it's like, this is not your job. Oh, but it goes so much faster if I help. But it's still not your job. And 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years in, I was still having to say this because they didn't really know how to do it. And at some point, it's like, I finally had enough sense to say to him, I said, so how did you get so good at it? He says, because I did it myself. Yeah, that's why they're not learning. Because you've empowered them to not learn. And I think that's the problem that we have a lot, particularly in growing businesses. Because like I said, the fast answer, because that was always why my husband would do it, is like, oh, because we, if we do it, it'll take an hour and a half. But if they have to do it by themselves, it's going to take 5 or 6 hours. It's like, But the next time, it'll take them probably 3 hours. And the next time, it'll take them an hour and a half. So what happens is we get caught in the, let's just solve the problem. We'll just solve the problem.
Right.
And all it's doing is continuing to create the problem, because the real problem is they don't know how to do it. They're not taking ownership. They don't have the pieces. It's not the tactical thing that's not getting done. That's not actually the problem.
Yeah. And then so, I mean, this points to what you're saying, points to this, but I think there's a lot of habits that create a situation where the CEO is the bottleneck, right? And so this is one, right? Is that the CEO has to jump in and bail everybody out. What are some, because I do think having the CEO as a bottleneck is a structural problem, but to your point in our last episode, it's much more of a symptom than it is an actual root cause. There are varying root causes that lead the CEO to being the bottleneck. Yeah. One is, as you pointed out, they're not empowering their people to solve the problems. They have to come in and save the day.
So another situation is back to people not being clear what their responsibility actually is.
Ambiguity.
Yeah. And truly role clarity. And back to, this happens a lot in a growing business, because when we started, we were doing this, and now we're doing this, and now we're doing this, and now we're, and it becomes this mishmash of things. And often early on, Susie is doing, thing A, thing B, thing C, thing D, and thing E. And it made sense because Susie was one of your only resources. But now you've got 4 people, and Susie's still doing those 5 things, but 2 of those things really belong to Fred, and one of those things really belongs to Jane. And so Jane knows that she probably should be doing it, but Susie still thinks she has ownership of it. And so a lot of that is coming back to the CEO, the owner, to get clarity, or it's having to go from Jane to the CEO, back to Susie, back to the CEO. So there's a lot of places where that role clarity of who actually owns it. And if they can't fully own it, then we're back to bottleneck, because who always owns everything in the very, very end is the CEO. But a lot of things the CEO doesn't need to own on an average day-to-day basis, but they still do, because we don't have role clarity.
And when we don't have role clarity, back to your favorite topic, right? We have gaps in accountability.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the list, at that point, it becomes really, really hard, because we because then the only person that actually is accountable back to is the CEO. When the only person that's accountable to the success of the business is the CEO, then
Right.
you're always going to have a bottleneck.
Yeah.
Always going to have a bottleneck.
So how do you, if you're this, you're listening to this and you're the CEO who's like, oh my gosh, I am the default workhorse. I am the one carrying the burden. I mean, I'm paying people to share the
Right.
burden, but for some reason it all comes back to me. How do you redistribute the work without the CEO's worst nightmare, which is dropping critical balls? I mean, when we talk about this all the time, right, they don't know what to delegate because they don't feel like anything is safe to delegate. Or because they've been the default workhorse, they're not confident that if they step out and completely delegate, the thing will get done. So how do you redistribute the work?
So part of the problem that I see a lot is that the CEO is used to running at a gazillion miles an hour. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I describe it is the CEO is usually a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, depending on, where you land. And the thing is, and it always cracks me up when I see a Ferrari or a Lamborghini running around town someplace, because those cars are not designed to go 15 miles an hour.
What? They're not designed to drop the kids off at school?
They are not designed to drop the kids off at school. They are designed to be on racetracks and,
Mm-hmm.
the Autobahn. And, they are designed to go fast. And they need to go fast to continue to function. If they're always running around town, they're actually going to break down way, 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 way faster. So, and most CEOs, quite honestly, are Ferraris. That's the nature of who they are. They are Ferraris. They may have hired some, high performance, Toyotas or a Lexus or something, that's still a pretty high performance car, but it's not the same.
Yeah.
It's not the same. And you don't actually want everyone to be a Ferrari, because that actually doesn't work either. You actually need these other folks. But the problem is most CEOs start setting unrealistic expectations
Mm.
and are not giving enough space and time for people to actually get the work done in the way that they need to get the work done. And so they keep taking things back,
Mm-hmm.
and they're assuming that everything that drops is going to break and is going to create this massive problem. Where the reality is a lot of things can drop, and if you let them drop, they'll bounce.
Mm.
And what you really need to do is let them see, it's like, oh, that dropped, that bounced, we're okay. Oh, that one broke. You got to pay attention to that next time. You can't let that break. And let people make their mistakes, understand how long it really takes, do all of those things so that they start taking full ownership, which means when it breaks, the owner doesn't clean up the glass.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, go get the broom, go get the dustpan, pick it up, get yourself cut on the shard. You've got to deal with all of that.
Right.
Right? You've got to have all of the consequences. You've got to have the win consequences, but you also have to have the lose consequences, whatever they are. But so often the owner has gotten used to being able to make things happen so quickly that when it doesn't, they feel like it's a failure, even if it's not.
Yeah.
Right? And so part of it is them being able to say, I've got really good team. They are not Ferraris. I can't run them like a Ferrari.
Yeah.
Right. And like I said, making them also have ownership of it. But back to this process takes time, because you don't want to just delegate big things without gaining understanding and trust. And, we've got, I think we probably have 2 or 3 podcasts where we've talked about this before. That process takes time. And so that's where most people are really, really struggling, is because at the point that they want to delegate it, they just want it delegated and that's it.
Well,
It's
they
like,
want to dump it. They don't want to delegate.
well,
Because
okay,
delegating takes work and time
perfect
and
phrase.
attention.
Yeah, perfect phrase. They just want it off their plate. They just want it done. And it's like, yeah, that's not actually delegation. You're right. The dump is a perfect description for it. They just want to dump it out. They want to completely abdicate on their responsibility of it. And so that's one of the places that it becomes hard. When folks aren't stepping up, it probably means you're not communicating enough. And you and I've had this conversation privately and I think publicly more than once, which is we forget how many things we know and we make assumptions on.
Mm-hmm.
And we aren't giving, most of the time, the problem I see is we aren't giving enough of the why behind the action or the behavior for someone else to own it in a way that we want them to own it.
Mm-hmm.
Because the why is so obvious to us because the business built around us.
Right, right. Well, and, when I think about it, things that have worked for me in my past employment history, is like just being clear on what the priorities are. Back to your point of the balls that break versus the balls that bounce. I worked for an organization that was all remote, and they were definitely remote first. And so it was very rare when you had a question that you could reach somebody who had the answer right then and there. And I remember early on, the person who was supervising me said, at the end of the day, all that matters to us is the client experience. So if you're facing something, just default to whatever gives the client the best experience. And if you make a mistake, don't beat yourself up for anything that didn't have a direct impact on the client experience, because that's the only thing we're going to come to you to fix. You mess up some back-end spreadsheet formatting, you delete the whole back-end spreadsheet. Is our ops team going to be ticked? Heck yeah. But you know what? You'll still have a job here because you didn't affect our client experience, and you can rebuild it. So I think that's part of it is letting your team know what you lose sleep over and what you don't, so that they're not fretting over things that you think are inconsequential.
Right. Right. And, the other thing that happens as you're going through this is helping them understand you want them to know more about it than you do.
Yes. So that they don't worry about stepping on your toes or making you look bad or feel bad.
Yeah, exactly. And that is also a really hard thing for CEO founders to release.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to be really conscious about, it's like, no, I don't want to be involved in this decision, and I don't need to be involved in this decision because I know you actually can make a better decision than I can at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And getting folks to where they really understand that that is true. It's the hardest thing as you start building up team underneath you. But when you say it in a large environment, people are like, well, no, why would they know that? But yet we think that in a smaller environment that it should be true. Like the classic thing is like, does the CEO of Coke know how to make Coca-Cola? My guess is no. Maybe. I doubt it. Right? At some point, way, way, way back when, the CEO of Coca-Cola did know how to make Coca-Cola.
Right.
Right? But over time, that changed. And I have no idea when that was, but over time that changes. And so at some point it's like, I don't have to actually know how to do all of these things. I need to know who knows, or I need to know who knows, depending on, how big the organization is. I need to be aware of these things, but I don't necessarily need to be the one who knows these things. And that's a tough transition, I think, for most CEOs.
Yeah, I mean, that actually leads right into my next question, right? Because I think, as you're laying this all out, I'm like, oh, their identity does get tangled in, right? It's like, okay, I'm the founder, I'm the entrepreneur, I'm the CEO, but then somewhere along the lines, their identity is tangled into all functions of the business, regardless of how many people they've hired. So how do you adjust your role identity? I mean, I think the first step, I'll just feed you that one, right? I know, is understanding what is the role of a CEO. You always say your number one job as CEO is to ensure the health and well-being of your business, not anybody else. But what does that mean and which aspects of the business are most important? But after you understand that piece, how do you work to adjust that role identity so that you are spending your time in that space and not over here doing what honestly feels good because it's a lot more instant gratification?
Well, and balancing the piece, and I'd love to say I have a magic bullet to that. I never do. That's not the way my world works. But one of the things is also to understand what are the pieces that either you bring unique skills to, right, and or that you really love,
Mm-hmm.
right? And saying the pieces that I don't bring unique skills to, making sure that you have people who do, right? And really empowering them and saying, I need for you to be the expert on this.
Mm-hmm.
And I need to be able to ask you questions. I need you to not have to ask me questions about this thing that you are the expert on.
Right.
Right. Now, there may be aspects where I need to brainstorm with you because you and I have enough knowledge together to be able to figure something out. But it's not that I'm expecting you to solve the problem
Mm-hmm.
for me. And this is where we start filling in that gap because everyone counts on the CEO to be the person, right?
Right.
Going back to the Coca-Cola example, there was a point, like I said, I have no idea when, I don't have any sort of history, but there was a point when the manufacturing process changed enough that the CEO no longer knew all of the right steps. They may have known the formula for how to make it, but they didn't know, how to run all of the various pieces of machinery and equipment and all of the things, right? And sometimes it's a time issue, but sometimes it's a growth issue because it just doesn't make
Mm-hmm.
sense. And so that to me is the piece that people have to be really aware of is you got to figure out if you're pulling yourself out, who is the expert coming in and does everyone understand that that's that expert now?
Mm-hmm.
That's who it is. It's not me. And part of that then is deflecting back any questions to the right person and
Right.
saying, it's fine that you came to me, but that was a waste of your time. You need to go to Tanya because Tanya
Mm-hmm.
actually knows that piece of information. I don't.
Yeah.
And even if you do know it,
Mm-hmm.
but to make it sound like, yeah, I'm not sure that I have current information. You need to check with Tanya.
Yeah. That's a great question to go ask Tanya. Have
That's
you
a
asked
great
Tanya
question.
yet?
Yeah. So that they start seeing you're not in that hole
Mm-hmm.
anymore. Like I said, even if you actually do know the answer.
Right. So I want to speak to the CEO who's like, this sounds great and all, but they have trust issues. And maybe it's because in their mind they've tried to delegate before and it's just blown up in their face. I love what you're saying, Gwen, but how do you let go of the trust issues? How do you develop the trust? And I know you would say the trust goes both ways. The staff has to trust you as well to not
Mhm.
take things back away.
Mhm.
But how do you go to developing that trust as you're redefining your identity within your own organization?
So the first is to really be prepared that the delegation process, true delegation where someone else has ownership, is not going to be instant. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, if it's a super, super, super simple task, it can be instant.
Right.
Like, but most of the time it's not instant. A lot of this, we've been talking about it in our other work is setting up consistency,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that takes time because the first time it's like, oh yeah, I'm in. And the second time I'm in. And then the third time it's like, oh, I'm not quite so in. And the fourth time it's like, oh, it'll just be easier to do it myself. And at that point, you get to start all over again,
Yeah.
right back at the beginning. So being consistent with the process and not reverting because it'll be easier is one of the big pieces for building the trust. Most of the reason I see most people lose the trust is because they're like, well, we've been doing this for 3 months. And it's like, yeah, but you took it back 5 times out of the, out of the 20 times that it was gone. So you haven't actually been doing it for 20 months, for 6 months or whatever. You've really only been doing this for about a month and a half, because every time you do that, it starts back, it resets the clock, right?
No matter how tedious it feels.
No matter how tedious it feels. The other is doing it incrementally, right? So obviously first is to make sure, do they actually know how to do the thing? And, there's some early steps. But as you start getting to a place that you want them to really take ownership, is to start testing, do they know enough to take ownership? And so if they come to you and say, should I do X or Y? You don't answer anymore. You say, what do you think you should do? Why do you believe that's the best answer? What would be an alternative? Why would that be a better answer? Why would that be a worse answer? It's actually taking time to get into their brain to see how they're thinking about it.
Yeah.
Because once you understand how they're thinking about it, then you can say, oh yeah, they're thinking about it correctly, or they're not thinking about it correctly. They're missing some piece of information. Sometimes you can fix it. Sometimes you can't. And if you can't, then you need to just say, cut bait. This person's not going to be able to take this on because they can't think in the way I need them to think. Right? And not that they're, a bad person or they're stupid or anything else. Sometimes it's a bad experience. Sometimes it's just the way our brain works. It's all those things. But once you get past the can they do the task, then we need to get into understanding how they think. And that's where we really start building the trust. Is I know, and you and I have had these conversations many times before. I know how you think enough that I know that you'll make choices that I want you to make, even when your answer is not the answer I would have given. But I'm okay with that.
Right.
Because it's not so antithesis to what I would do that it's problematic.
Yeah.
Right. And so that to me is where you start really building the trust piece. And then it's coming back to when they come to you, it's like, I don't want you to come to me. I want you to come to me only when.
Right.
This situation, that situation, the other situation. And so that allows the trust to be built over time. And then, of course, the trick and the hard trick is when it breaks, because it probably will, something will happen, is to not revert clear back to the beginning again. Only go back as far as you need to go. Sometimes it's just a mistake. Things happen, right? And to not overreact and like, oh my gosh, you did blah, 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 and completely lose it. But sometimes it's like, oh, the fact that you thought that was okay, you're fired.
Right.
Because like I trusted you and oh my gosh, I had no reason to trust you if you thought that was okay. Right. But most of the time it's a mistake. And to be clear on how did that happen? What do we make sure it happens so that doesn't happen again?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good place to leave it today, I think. So I think to sum it up, right, is when you're doing all the work, but you still feel stuck, ultimately what has happened in your business, whether you realize it or not, is you've become the default workhorse. And you've become the default workhorse, as Gwen pointed out, because the business got built up around you. So of course it did. Like in many cases, unless you've very intentionally built out your business, there was no other way for it to get built out.
It's going to happen like 95% of the time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the natural way of things.
Right. But you've got to recognize it. And part of how you recognize it, right, is you're the bottleneck. And a lot of times what leads to being the bottleneck is you don't have role clarity. As you've hired people, there's just fuzzy, blurry lines in between what they do and you do and all of those things. Leads to gaps in accountability And that's why all the decisions end up landing at your doorstep and nothing moves forward until you move it forward. So you've got to redistribute the work. And as Gwen said, it is possible to do that without dropping any balls, right? In making sure that people understand what you expect of them, right? What their good, better, best targets are in performance. And that when push comes to shove or when they run into a challenge, that you let them drop the ball so that they can learn from experience which balls bounce and which balls break. I love that analogy, Gwen. I love that one. Probably that's my favorite analogy you've ever come up with. And finally, when it comes to adjusting that role identity, because that's the job only you can do, because you're probably going to have the hardest time with it, is it really comes to building trust with yourself, trust with your team. And in doing that, your team will trust you in return. So these are the sorts of thoughts, of conversations that CEOs need to have regularly. And if you're not in the practice of having these types of reflective conversations, a great next step for you, especially if this episode has resonated, is to subscribe to Gwen's question email every week. Now, it's only a two-way conversation if you want it to be. You don't have to respond, but every Friday, a question from Gwen is going to land in your inbox. A question that will prompt you to spend 5 to 10 minutes really reflecting on what's going on in your business and how that compares to what you want happening in your business. If you reply, Gwen's going to respond to you. If you don't reply, that's okay. Another question lands in your inbox the following Friday. You can sign up at everydayeffectiveness.com/question. And until then, we'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in to The Business You Really Want with Gwen Bortner. I'm Tanya Kubo, reminding you that sustainable success is within reach. Make sure to subscribe to the show and visit thebusinessyoureallyWant.com for more resources. Until next time, keep dreaming big and acting with intention.